37-year-old Sandy Rosso stood behind the bar at the Green Iguana Bar and Grill, not far from the beach in Rocky Point, Florida. The summer crowds had already started arriving in waves to the area, and so the place at night was totally packed. Music was blaring, people were dancing and shouting, and the line at the bar just kept getting longer. Sandy saw a man wave down, so she walked over to him. She leaned across the bar so she could hear his order over the music, and then she smiled. And Sandy's smile showed off her perfect teeth that seemed even wider than they really were because of her very bronze-tanned skin. She also had long hair with blonde highlights, and the body of someone who worked out all the time. And when she was younger, Sandy had worked as a fitness model, and she still had dreams of becoming a movie star someday. Because of her looks, men at the bar often made it a point to order their drinks from Sandy instead of one of the other bartenders. And the men almost always told her how pretty she was, and that night was no different. Sandy poured the man his drink and slid it across the bar to him, and right away he told her she was totally beautiful, and he left her a great tip. Sandy smiled again, and then moved on to the next customer. Sandy used to love all the attention she got from men at the bar, but over the last year or so, she had stopped trusting people, especially men, like she used to. So she had started to keep her guard up a little more at work. For most of her life, Sandy had always thought the best of people, and she believed that when you treated others with kindness, they would do the same to you. But that had all changed for Sandy about a year earlier, after she'd had a horrible experience with a man who she thought was one of her best friends. That man, Tracy Humphrey, had been a part-time bouncer at the last place Sandy had worked as a bartender. Tracy was this big, 6 feet 2 inches tall, bald guy who looked like a big weightlifter. He was actually known as Mr. Clean because he looked like the big, bulky guy on the labels of Mr. Clean cleaning products. Tracy and Sandy had first bonded over their love of fitness, and when Sandy found out Tracy worked as a trainer at a gym, she had started taking classes from him. Sandy also loved that Tracy had connections to Hollywood. He claimed he'd been the stunt double for the action movie star Vin Diesel, and that he had worked as Tom Cruise's personal bodyguard. And when Sandy would tell her friends that she still dreamed of acting in movies someday, Tracy was one of the only ones who told her that her dream really could still come true. And so Sandy had hoped that she and Tracy would be friends forever, because they got along so well and he supported her dreams, and she always felt relaxed and safe with him. But then, one night, when they had been hanging out at Sandy's place, Tracy had tried to pressure Sandy into having sex with him. Sandy got upset and said that was not what she wanted, and she made that clear to Tracy. But when Sandy turned him down, Tracy had gotten angry and gone into a rage. And so soon after that incident, Sandy had left that job and started working instead at the Green Iguana, so she wouldn't have to see Tracy anymore at work. But even after she had quit, Tracy had kept calling her and bothering her. But by May of 2003, the calls had finally stopped. Sandy heard a rumor that Tracy had started dating a 20-year-old woman named Ashley, so she thought maybe that meant he would leave her alone for good. From behind the bar at the Green Iguana, Sandy could see the crowd was finally starting to thin out. Her feet were aching from standing up all night, and she was excited her shift was ending, and she could finally go home. A little while later, she checked in with her manager to say she was leaving. She counted her tips for the night and then walked through the kitchen towards the back of the building. While Sandy was getting ready to leave, people outside were making their way from one bar to the next, and music was pumping from dance clubs and from parties all across the beach nearby. But a short, bearded man wearing baggy jeans, a sweatshirt, and a baseball cap blocked out all that noise and walked straight down the sidewalk in front of the Green Iguana. The bearded man pushed his way through a crowd of people and then headed around the building to the large parking lot in back. Once the bearded man got to the parking lot, he climbed into his Volkswagen Beetle car and closed the door. Then he leaned over to the back seat and grabbed a rifle that he'd stashed there. Then the bearded man picked up a pair of old jeans on the passenger seat and slid the barrel of the rifle through one of the pant legs to conceal the barrel when he raised the gun. The bearded man lowered the passenger side window, stretched across the car, and propped the now concealed barrel of the rifle on the open window, and then watched patiently at the back door of the Green Iguana. It was hot in the car, and he could feel sweat dripping down his forehead from under his hat. But he just kept on focusing on that back door. Then finally Sandy, who had just finished her shift, came out the back door. As soon as the bearded man saw her, he raised his rifle up and aimed it right at her and fired. The bearded man heard glass break, and he saw Sandy look around wildly around the parking lot. The bearded man was confused for a second, but then he realized he hadn't hit Sandy. He had missed. He'd shot the side mirror on his own car. The bearded man panicked and looked around to see if anyone had seen him. Then he tossed the rifle into the back seat, started up his car, and sped off. Back in the parking lot, Sandy got into her black BMW convertible like nothing had happened. She'd heard the glass break, and she'd heard the shot most likely, and the car speeding off, but she just kind of figured that maybe some drunk guy had smashed a bottle somewhere and then driven away. She didn't realize she had been shot at. So inside of her car, Sandy started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and headed home. And after about a 25-minute drive, Sandy arrived in her quiet, well-lit neighborhood and pulled up to the 2-story townhouse she shared with her friend, Tony Pony Call. Then she parked her car in the garage and went inside. Tony got home not too long after her, and they both stayed up for a bit, talking. And then eventually Sandy went up to bed and fell asleep, not realizing that earlier that night someone had tried to kill her. The following month, Sandy spent most of her time at work or hanging out with her friends, and she was having fun and making good money, and she felt like her life was moving in a really positive direction. But as good as things were going for her, she'd started to worry a little bit about Tony, the man she lived with. It had become clear to Sandy that Tony was in love with her, and he wanted to be more than just roommates. And Sandy admitted to some of her friends that she kind of liked Tony too. He was sweet, he worked hard, and he treated Sandy like a queen. And the two of them had even gone on a few dates. But after what had happened to Sandy with Tracy, she still wasn't ready to fully trust anyone. And so Sandy had told Tony that she didn't want to have a serious relationship with him, and that they were great as friends and roommates, but they should both be able to date whoever else they wanted. Tony said he understood, but there were still times he acted like they were a couple, and that concerned Sandy. On July 5th, over a month after the secret, failed shooting in the parking lot, Tony and Sandy hung out for a little while at their townhouse before Sandy left for work. And when she left, Tony told her to have a great day, and everything seemed good between them. And Sandy hoped Tony was finally okay with just being friends and roommates again. And when Sandy got to work, any thoughts about Tony quickly disappeared because the bar was so crowded that all she could think about was the next drink she had to make. July 4th weekend at the bar made other summer weekends look tame in comparison, and Sandy could feel her legs burning and her back aching as she made her way up and down the bar, pouring drinks for what seemed like a never-ending line of... But even though she was tired and busy, she was still in a great mood, because everyone was making a lot of money that night, and all of the customers seemed like they were really having a great time. And then, after working non-stop for hours, C's shift ended at about 10:30 p.m. So she counted up her tips. She said goodnight to everybody, walked through the kitchen, out the back door, and into the parking lot. And when Sandy stepped outside, she immediately heard a loud bang. And right away, Sandy was startled. But then she looked up and saw it was just fireworks exploding over the beach. Sandy smiled, climbed into her car, and headed home. And a little after 11 p.m. that night, Sandy pulled onto her street that was lined with small homes and townhouses just like hers, and she noticed how quiet everything was. She figured everybody must still be out, or they must have gone to bed early after partying the day before, on July 4th. Sandy pulled into her driveway. She opened her garage door and parked her car inside of the garage. She turned off her car's engine, pulled her keys out of the ignition, and leaned over to grab her purse on the passenger seat. But while she was leaning over, she heard something slam against the driver's side window. Sandy turned to see what had made the noise, and a look of fear came across her face. Then Sandy screamed, raised her feet up, and began kicking the driver's side door over and over and over. A few minutes after Sandy had gotten home, her roommate Tony flipped on the light in their kitchen. Tony was tan with short brown hair, and he was only wearing boxer shorts. He'd expected Sandy to stay out late that night, so he'd gone up to bed. But when he heard something going on in their garage, he headed back downstairs to see if Sandy had gotten home. So Tony walked across their kitchen and opened the door that led out to the garage, and he saw Sandy's black BMW parked right there. But he didn't see Sandy in the car. Tony shouted her name in case maybe she was outside, out front of their property, but she didn't yell. So Tony took a few steps into the garage toward Sandy's car. Then he leaned forward and looked in through the passenger side window, and right away his breath caught in his chest. In the car, Tony saw Sandy lying slumped over the center console, and her car seats were covered in blood. Immediately, Tony ran around to the driver's side of the car, and as he did, he felt glass pierce his bare feet, and he saw the driver's side window was shattered. Tony shook off the pain in his feet. He opened the door and climbed inside. He pulled Sandy into his arms and tried to talk to her, but she was unresponsive. Then Tony reached into Sandy's own pocket, grabbed her cell phone, and dialed 911. The emergency operator picked up, and right away a look of complete calm suddenly came across Tony's face. And when the operator asked him what was wrong, Tony said in a slow, steady voice that his girlfriend was bleeding in her car, and he couldn't wake her up. At about 11:30 p.m., 15 minutes after Tony had made that 911 call, Detective Scott Geske of the Pinellas Park Police Department was sitting on the couch at his house when his son, Ski, as everybody called Detective Geske, had spent a relaxing weekend celebrating the 4th of July. But as soon as he heard his phone ring late at night, he knew his relaxing weekend had just come to an end. Ski answered the phone and had a quick conversation with his boss. And a few minutes later, he was on the road heading to Sandy's townhouse. As Ski drove through the neighborhood and turned onto Sandy Street, he was a little surprised this was the call he'd gotten. On a holiday weekend, his first thought had been that maybe something had happened in the part of town where a bunch of people were drinking at the clubs and bars. But when he parked in front of Sandy's townhouse on her quiet street, he figured he was most likely dealing with a domestic dispute that had turned violent. Ski stepped out of his car and walked up Sandy's driveway. He was in his late 30s, and he was average height, with broad shoulders and short brown hair. He'd lived in Florida for years, but he'd grown up in New York and had never lost his New York accent. Ski heard one of the officers who was already on the scene call out his name. So he walked towards them in the garage and saw Sandy's black BMW. Glass from the shattered driver's side window was all over the ground, and Ski saw bloody prints from someone's bare feet. And when he looked in the car, he saw the seats and floorboards were spattered with blood. The officer who had called him over told Ski that a woman in her 30s, Sandy Roseau, had been shot in her car. The victim had been rushed to the hospital, but she had been pronounced dead not long after her arrival. Ski asked who had called 911, and the officer said Sandy's boyfriend. And he also said a cop at the hospital told him that the boyfriend had followed the ambulance to the hospital in his own car before police had arrived at the townhouse. Ski made a mental note of that. There was nothing strange about a boyfriend rushing off to the hospital where his girlfriend had been shot, but police must have been very close behind the ambulance. And so he wondered if maybe the boyfriend had wanted to get away before having to face the cops. Then a ballistics expert on the scene walked over to Ski and pointed out where they had found multiple shell casings in the car and in the garage. And Ski realized that whoever had shot Sandy made little or no effort to cover their tracks. And Ski thought that could indicate one of two things. Someone had either seen the shooter in the act, and so the shooter had panicked and ran, or the shooter had very little experience with firearms and didn't understand all the evidence a gun could leave behind. Ski wanted to test out his first theory and see if anyone had caught the shooter in the act. So he and a few other officers started going door to door in the neighborhood to ask questions. But Sandy's neighbors had either been out when the attack took place, or they had already gone to bed, and so nobody had heard or seen a thing. So after canvassing the neighborhood, Ski went back to Sandy's townhouse. He and the other officers had already been in there for hours, but he told himself he wasn't going to sleep until he was sure they had found every piece of evidence possible at the crime scene. By 6:30 a.m. on July 6th, so about 7 hours after Ski had gotten the call from his boss, Ski was still at Sandy's townhouse. He was out on the driveway, making sure they hadn't missed any tire tracks or any other evidence out there. And as he did that, he looked up and saw the sun rising. And that was when he realized how tired he was. But just then, a Toyota 4Runner vehicle pulled up in front of the townhouse, and a man stepped out of the car and started walking toward Ski, and Ski immediately felt a jolt of energy. The man introduced himself as Tony Pony, called the victim's boyfriend. He was now wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, and he said he'd spoken to officers at the hospital, and they had let him go. And so he wanted to come back home to see if he could help the police who were there. Ski was shocked at how calm Tony seemed. His girlfriend had just been shot and killed, and he showed up at the scene of the crime like he was there to just help them find a missing dog or something. But Ski knew shock affected people differently, so he didn't want to jump to conclusions. Ski asked Tony if they could go inside and talk through the events of the previous evening. Tony smiled and said he'd be happy to help. And as they walked across the yard towards the front door, Ski noticed that there were scratches on Tony's hands and arms. Once they were inside, Tony led Ski through a foyer with peach-colored tile floors and into a living room with a high ceiling. Tony sat down on the couch, and Ski sat in a chair across from him. Police had found no evidence of forced entry in the house, and Tony said nobody other than him had come into the house that night. Then, with an almost blank look on his face, Tony said he'd been in the upstairs bedroom when he heard something going on in the garage. So he went downstairs to see if maybe Sandy had gotten home, and he told Ski about how he had found Sandy slumped over in her car. But even when talking about the moment he had found Sandy with blood all over her face and clothes and all over the car, Tony remained completely calm. So Ski leaned in a bit closer and asked Tony if he and Sandy's relationship was serious or more like casual dating. And Tony said Sandy was actually his fiancée. A confused look came across Ski's face, and he pointed out that Tony had just introduced himself as Sandy's boyfriend. But Tony quickly said that he just hadn't gotten used to being engaged yet. Ski nodded but watched Tony's face closely to see if he looked like he might be lying. But Tony's appearance never changed. So Ski pointed at Tony's hands and arms and asked him how he'd gotten all those cuts. Tony said when he climbed into the car to try to revive Sandy, he'd cut his arms and his hands on the shattered glass. And he also said he had not been wearing shoes or socks at the time, and he'd cut his bare feet as well on the glass on the ground. And when he said this, Ski figured that probably cleared up who those bloody footprints belonged to. Then finally, Ski looked Tony in the eye and asked him if he could think of anyone who might want to harm or kill Sandy. And for the first time, Tony's calm, cool demeanor disappeared. His face started to turn red. He clenched his jaw. And then he said there was one person who definitely could have killed Sandy. And that guy was a guy they called Mr. Clean, Tracy Humphrey. In his time as a detective, Ski had tried to stick to a simple rule: never get tunnel vision when working a case. Over the years, he'd seen a lot of cops build cases entirely around one suspect. And when that suspect turned out to be innocent, the cases just fell apart. So in the days following Sandy's murder, Ski still definitely considered Tony to be a major suspect. Tony was the one who had found Sandy and called 911, and he had those scratches on his hands and arms. And on the day after the murder, Ski had heard from one of Sandy's co-workers at the Green Iguana that Sandy had never agreed to marry Tony, and she'd actually told him she didn't want a serious relationship with him at all. So Tony calling Sandy his fiancée just seemed totally strange to Ski. But Tony had undergone a gunpowder residue test to determine if he'd recently fired a gun. He had willingly submitted DNA samples, and he had allowed the forensics team to do a thorough investigation of his car. And so, while the investigators waited for all those test results to come back, Ski started looking into other possible suspects. And someone who worked at the Green Iguana had seen a bearded man kind of lurking outside the night Sandy was killed, but they had no idea who he was. So Ski now had Tony and this unknown bearded guy as possible suspects. But for the time, he wanted to turn his attention to Tracy Humphrey, aka Mr. Clean, the man who Tony was so sure could be Sandy's killer. So at 3 p.m. on July 8th, less than 3 days after Sandy's murder, Ski paid a visit to the gym where Tracy worked as an instructor and personal trainer. Ski walked into the gym and heard the sound of trainers shouting encouragement and people grunting while they lifted weights. Then he walked up to the front desk, showed the man behind the counter his badge, and asked to speak with Tracy. The employee said he would go get Tracy and pointed Ski to a small office where he could have some privacy. Ski thanked the man and then walked into the office, took a seat at a table with nothing on it, and waited. And a couple of minutes later, Tracy walked in. He was 36 years old, out of breath, dripping with sweat, and had a towel. Ski smiled and said he knew Tracy was working, so he wouldn't take up much of his time. Then he asked if Tracy had heard about what happened to his friend Sandy. Tracy said he'd read about it in the newspaper and that he was totally heartbroken. Ski told Tracy that he was very sorry for his loss, because Ski believed that it was always a good idea to start a line of questioning by empathizing. But before Ski could actually ask a follow-up question, Tracy suddenly stood up and said he did not feel comfortable talking to police at work, and that if Ski had a problem with that, he could contact Tracy's lawyer. Ski was surprised the conversation had taken such a quick turn, and it definitely made him question why Tracy wanted to get out of there so fast. But he didn't have anything to charge Tracy with, so he just thanked Tracy for his time, stepped out of the office, and walked back through the gym. And when Ski stepped outside, right away he felt the sun on his face and a warm breeze blowing. The temperature was about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and Ski thought that this was the perfect kind of summer day to go to the beach. And right there, it struck him that Sandy would never get to enjoy these perfect summer days in Florida ever again, because someone had robbed her of her future. And that made Ski very angry. He wanted to find Sandy's killer as fast as he could. And the conversation he just had inside the gym made him want to dig a lot deeper into Tracy's life. Over the following week, Ski and the investigative team returned to Sandy's townhouse multiple times to see if any new evidence had emerged. And they also followed up with Sandy's co-workers to see if they remembered something from the night of Sandy's murder that they might have overlooked the first time they were interviewed. But nothing new surfaced. So during that time, Ski also did something that some other detectives might not have done. Ski's father had been a fireman, and so Ski had always admired firefighters and had close relationships with a lot of them in the area. And so he reached out to friends at different local fire departments, filled them in on the Sandy Roseau case, and asked them to please let him know if they had anything that might help him find Sandy's killer and bring them to justice. Ski didn't know if anything would come of asking these firemen for help, but it just made sense to him to use all the resources at his disposal. But as the days passed, no new evidence came in from anywhere. And so Ski started to really get frustrated, and he wanted to move the investigation forward. But he'd run into a big problem. Tracy's lawyer had told Tracy not to say another word to police about Sandy's murder. And that was a major roadblock for Ski, because even if Tracy hadn't killed Sandy, the police couldn't rule him out if they didn't get any information from him. But Ski refused to let this lawyer bring his investigation to a stop. So he came up with a plan to work around Tracy. Ski had learned that Tracy recently married a 20-year-old woman named Ashley, who worked with him at the gym. So he figured if he couldn't talk to Tracy, maybe he could talk to Tracy's new wife. But Ski wanted to make sure Ashley was alone when he met with her, because if Tracy was there, Ashley almost certainly would be told not to talk. So at around 3 p.m. on July 16th, 11 days after Sandy's murder, Ski drove to the gym where Tracy and Ashley worked and parked right outside. Then he stepped out of his car and walked right up to the large windows out front and pressed his face up to the glass to look inside. But he couldn't see if Tracy or Ashley were in the gym or not. So Ski went inside, walked up to the employee he'd met there the last time, and asked if Tracy was working. The man said he was, but that he just started teaching a class. So Ski asked if Ashley was working, and the man said no, she had the day off. And that was all Ski needed to hear. He turned around, rushed out of the gym, and ran to his car. He knew he was in a race now. As soon as Tracy finished his class and found out a cop had been looking for him and Ashley, Tracy would call his wife to tell her not to talk. So Ski got in his car, started the engine, peeled out, and sped off down the street. And about 10 minutes later, after speeding across town, Ski hit the brakes and parked his car in front of the apartment building where Tracy and Ashley lived. He took a deep breath, calmed himself down, and then got out of the car and walked to their apartment. After knocking on the door opened, and it was Ashley. She was pretty, with long brown curly hair and big eyes, and she was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. Ski showed her his badge and asked if he could come inside and talk for a bit. Ashley shifted back and forth on her feet, and she had a nervous look on her face, but she said, "Okay." Ashley closed the door behind them, and then led Ski to their living room. Ashley walked around a wooden coffee table and sat down on the couch, and Ski took a seat in a nearby chair. Once they were seated, Ski asked her how long she'd been married to Tracy, and Ashley said they'd actually just gotten married on July 4th at the gym where they worked. Ski smiled and said, "It must have been nice to have a wedding on a holiday with fireworks going off all night." Then Ski asked her if she and her new husband had gone on a honeymoon right after their wedding. But Ashley laughed and said the following night, July 5th, they just rented some movies, ordered pizza, and just hung out on the couch. Ashley shifted her position on the couch and asked what this was all about. But Ski just kept on smiling and asked where they had rented the movies and gotten pizza from, and Ashley gave him the name of the video store and the pizza place. Then Ashley's cell phone, which was sitting on the coffee table, started to ring. She sat up straight and looked at the phone, and then asked Ski if she could answer it. And Ski said, of course it was her phone. So Ashley grabbed the phone, walked into the kitchen, and answered the call. and when Ski heard her talking from the other room, he knew it was Tracy on the other line, and that getting any more information out of Ashley was going to be impossible. But Ski kept on smiling because he'd gotten what he'd come for. Ashley had just given Tracy an alibi for the night of the murder, and now Ski just had to follow up on it. So after Ashley hung up and came back into the living room, Ski immediately just thanked her for her help, and then walked outside to his car. And not long after that, he drove to the video store that Ashley had mentioned. And an employee there pulled up Tracy's rental history and showed Ski that Tracy had indeed rented movies a few hours before Sandy had been murdered. After that, Ski drove to the pizza place that Ashley said they'd ordered from, and one of the pizza delivery drivers there pulled up their records on their computer, and the records showed that Tracy had ordered pizza less than an hour before Sandy's murder. And then the delivery driver told Ski that he remembered delivering that pizza to a tall, big, bald guy a little after 11 p.m. on July 5th, almost the exact time Sandy had been killed. Ski thanked the pizza delivery guy and then went back outside, got into his car, and headed for the police station. And as he drove, he felt like even though this was great information, it was like he had hit a big dead end. Tracy's simple alibi that he was at home eating pizza looked like it was the truth. And so Ski wondered if maybe he needed to take his focus off of Tracy for a while and turn it back to Sandy's roommate, Tony. But then, on the following day, Ski got a call from one of the people he'd spoken to at the Tampa Fire Department, and they said they'd found something in an arson case of theirs that they thought might be connected to Sandy's murder. And what the fire department told Ski would put his investigation right back on track, and it would lead him directly to the bearded man who had tried to shoot Sandy in the Green Iguana parking lot. Based on the report that Ski received from the fire department, evidence found at the crime scene, and information gathered throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Sandy on July 5, 2003. A little after 10:30 p.m. on July 5th, Z's killer had fallen asleep in a compact rental car in the Green Iguana parking lot. The killer was wearing a baseball cap pulled down low just above their eyes, and the thick sweatshirt and pants they were wearing had caused them to get so hot inside of the car that they dozed off for a few minutes. But then the sound of a car door slamming nearby had woken them up. They looked out the windshield and saw Sandy driving off in her black BMW. The killer immediately sat up straight and yelled out in frustration, and then slammed their hands down on the steering wheel. The killer had intended to shoot Sandy right there in the parking lot, but now that wasn't an option. So the killer glanced over and looked at their Ruger .22 caliber pistol on the passenger seat. And then they started the car and pulled out onto the street behind Sandy's BMW. The killer still felt a little out of it from having fallen asleep, and their hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, but they managed to weave their way through holiday weekend traffic and keep up with Sandy's car. Then, after about 25 minutes, the killer followed Sandy as she turned off a main road into her neighborhood. The killer eased off the gas to make sure they didn't get too close to Sandy's car. The killer saw Sandy pull into her driveway, open the garage door, and park her BMW inside of the garage. So the killer pulled the rental car right up to the curb in front of Sandy's townhouse. Then, with their heart pounding in anticipation, the killer wiped the sweat from their eyes. They grabbed the pistol off the passenger seat, opened the car door, and ran up the driveway into the garage. Once the killer was inside, they saw Sandy leaning over the passenger seat to grab her purse. So the killer ran up to the driver's side, raised the pistol, and slammed the butt of it into the window and held their hand up to shield their eyes from the glass. But they didn't break the window. Instead, the killer looked down and saw the glass intact. And inside the vehicle, Sandy had heard the sound, whipped herself around, and was looking up at them with a look of fear and confusion on her face. Then Sandy began screaming, and she raised her foot and began kicking the driver's side door over and over again, trying to open it to maybe slam into the killer. But the door didn't open, and Sandy just kept on kicking. Meanwhile, the killer could feel every muscle in their body start to tense up, and more sweat dripped down their face and neck, and their chest started to feel tight. And in a panic, the killer just raised their gun right up to the window and fired into the car. The window shattered, and glass flew at the killer, but they kept on firing over and over again until they had unloaded all 8 rounds into the car. Inside the BMW, Sandy was bleeding from her torso, her foot, her head. Blood covered her face and clothes and was spattered on the car seats and floorboards. She was choking, her vision was fading, and she was struggling to breathe. Then everything went black, and Sandy slumped over the center console. After looking inside the car and making sure Sandy was motionless, the killer turned and ran out of the garage, back down the driveway, got into their rental car, and once inside they took a deep breath and put the pistol back on the passenger seat, right next to the fake beard they had been wearing earlier. It would turn out the short, bearded man who had failed to kill Sandy and May when they had fired at her coming out of the bar and missed, and then had successfully killed Sandy on July 5th, was really a woman in disguise. It was Ashley Humphrey, Tracy's new wife. And on both occasions, Ashley had disguised herself as a man by wearing baggy jeans, a big sweatshirt, a baseball cap pulled down low, and a cheap fake beard. And she had made a point to be seen looking like a man by other people outside the Green Iguana, which is why she was kind of lurking around. She wanted to be seen. But on the night of the actual murder, Ashley, who had been wearing the beard, had been sweating so much that she had removed it when she'd actually gone inside the garage to kill Sandy. And it was the call from the Tampa Fire Department that actually led Ski back to Ashley, almost right after he had thought about moving on from her and her husband. On the night of Ashley's failed murder attempt on Sandy back in May, she had accidentally shot her own car's side mirror, and Ashley had worried that the bullet hole in her mirror would eventually attract police attention. So, in a total panic, Ashley had driven her Volkswagen Beetle with the shot-up side view mirror to a vacant lot and then set it on fire. And when the fire department investigated what they believed was a case of arson, they had traced the burned Volkswagen back to Ashley. And then, when they had talked to Ski about this, they realized that Ashley was in a relationship with Tracy Humphrey, who was one of Ski's major suspects. And so Ashley was ultimately arrested, and she confessed to killing Sandy. But the case didn't end there. Leading up to Ashley's trial, she cooperated with police, and she said Tracy had threatened her with violence in order to force her to murder Sandy. And she said Tracy had even made her marry him the night before the murder, because spouses cannot be forced to testify against each other in court. and it would turn out that Tracy had a clear motive for wanting to kill Sandy, because the fight he had had with Sandy when she refused to have sex with him had actually been far worse than most of Sandy's friends knew. On that night, after Tracy had flown into a rage, he had beaten Sandy and raped her. And eventually Sandy had filed charges against Tracy, and his trial was set to start in August of 2003. So he had gotten Ashley to kill Sandy so the state wouldn't have a witness to prove the allegations against him, and the trial would just go away. Despite Tony Pony Call's odd decision to call Sandy his girlfriend, and then also his fiancée when talking to police, along with his weirdly calm behavior in the immediate aftermath of Sandy's murder, he was not actually in any way connected to her death. Ashley was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison, and is scheduled for release in 2028. As for Tracy, in the lead-up to his murder trial, several women stepped forward and shared their own stories about how he had also abused them. Tracy was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The 1960s and 1970s, hitchhiking became very popular amongst young people in America. Hitchhiking is a form of transportation where you basically get rides from strangers. And so, the way it works is a hitchhiker will stand on the side of a busy road, and they'll extend their arm out, and they'll kind of hold their thumb up, which signals to passing motorists that they want to hitchhike. That's the kind of universal sign for hitchhiking. And then, a willing motorist, when they see a hitchhiker, they'll pull up alongside and offer a ride. Now, today it seems unfathomably dangerous to just hop into a stranger's car, or conversely for a motorist to pick up a random stranger on the side of the road. But back then, this was considered totally normal and socially acceptable. And so, with that in mind, on September 29, 1978, a 15-year-old girl named Mary Vincent was standing on the side of a highway just outside of Modesto, California, which is not far from San Francisco, California. Mary was a rebellious teenager who had recently run away from her home in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her parents were going through a very nasty divorce, and she just couldn't stand to be in the house anymore. And so, that's why she had run away. And so, she had hitchhiked all the way up to Los Angeles, California, where her grandfather lived. But after only being there for a couple of days, she became unbelievably homesick and wanted to go back and be around her parents and her family. And so, one day, when her grandfather was out, she slipped out of his house, and she began hitchhiking back to Las Vegas, Nevada. And so, she had hitchhiked from Los Angeles to Modesto, California. That's where the first person was willing to drive her to. And so, she was on that strip of highway in Modesto, looking for another ride that could take her farther south. She was on this highway with two other young hitchhikers. They all had these signs that said, "Going south." So they weren't just holding their thumbs out. They were holding these signs. And so the three of them are huddled in a group. They're holding their signs up. And at some point, mid-afternoon, this light blue passenger van that only had one passenger. It was the driver. He was a 50-something-year-old man. He looked pretty harmless. He pulled over when he saw their signs, and he parked on the side of the road, maybe 15 feet ahead of where they were. And so Mary's companions stayed where they were, and Mary ran up to this light blue van, and she looked through the passenger side window, which had been rolled down, and she asked this guy, "Hey, can you give all three of us a ride? We're going south." And this man, he would look at her and say, "I can only give you a ride. I can't give the other two a ride. I can only give you a ride." And so Mary is confused because she's looking at this guy, and she's seeing all this space in his van, and she's thinking to herself, why am I only allowed to go when they're going the same place I'm going? And there's plenty of room in this van. But when she kind of gently prodded this man and said, "Well, are you sure you don't mind taking them too?" He just said, "Look, I will take you. I will not take them." And so Mary said, "Okay, well, hold on. Let me go back and get my bag." And so he stays parked. She leaves the van and she runs back to the other two people she was with. And she explains the situation, and they tell her, "Mary, this is not good. There's clearly something off with this guy." But Mary, even though she too shared this kind of reservation about this guy, she was so desperate to get home. She was so homesick that she couldn't face the idea of having to wait around for another ride, which might not come until the next day or the day after, because not every motorist is willing to pick up hitchhikers. And she just did not want to wait any longer. And so she told her companions that, "Guys, I'm going to take the ride." And so she says goodbye to her two friends. She grabs her bag and she runs back up to the van, and she hops in the passenger seat. As soon as she sat down and closed the door, this man pulled back out onto the road and started driving. And then he turned and looked at Mary and introduced himself. His name was Lawrence Singleton, and he was 50 years old. And then Mary, she introduced herself. Then they have some small talk, and very quickly, Mary feels at ease around Lawrence. He kind of reminded her of her grandfather. He was very nice, very polite. And so when she started to feel tired pretty early on in their trip, she said, "Hey, Lawrence, do you mind if I doze off while you drive?" And Lawrence would say, "No problem. Go ahead, go to sleep." And so Mary turned away from Lawrence and kind of curled up on the seat, and pretty quickly she was asleep. A little while later, when she woke up, she looked out the window and immediately could tell they were going the wrong way. So she turns to Lawrence and says, "We're going the wrong way." And Lawrence would say, "Oh, you know what? I made a mistake. I'll get us turned around. Sorry about that. I had no idea." But Mary's thinking to herself, "We're really far in the wrong direction, and there's no way he accidentally did this." But she kind of bit her tongue, because Lawrence would actually turn around and start going in the right direction. And so they're traveling in the proper direction for a little while, and Mary's totally on edge, but she's careful not to give that off to Lawrence, because she doesn't really know this guy. And even though he did make her feel comfortable, she just doesn't really know what his intentions are. And so she's just kind of looking around pretty apprehensively. And then they pull into this stretch of highway. They kind of ran through this fairly forested area where very few cars were on this stretch of road. And Lawrence suddenly tells Mary that he wants to pull over because he has to go to the bathroom. He wants to relieve himself. And so Mary kind of apprehensively says, "Yeah, okay, that's fine." And so as Lawrence is beginning to pull off of the highway, Mary happens to look down at her feet, and she notices one of her shoes is untied. And instinctually, Mary just thought to herself, "I better make sure that shoe gets tied, because I might need to run away from this guy." but she didn't want to reach down and start tying her shoe. It was kind of awkward, 'cause the space was small, and she was worried it would be kind of suspicious if she did it. And so she thought, okay, as soon as we pull off, I'll get out of the car, and I'll tie my shoe. And so Lawrence, he pulls over, but he doesn't just pull over onto the shoulder of this road. Instead, he pulls into this access road that kind of trails into the forest. And so, as soon as he's turned onto this road, the alarm bells are going off in Mary's head. She knows something is wrong, but she doesn't really know what to say to Lawrence because he's not talking to her, and she doesn't really want to look at him. And so she's just kind of going over in her head what she's going to do. Is she going to run? Is she going to confront him? She doesn't know. And then, eventually, after about a minute or so, when they are far enough away from the main road that no one on that road could see them, they're pretty far into this forest. Lawrence stops the car, and he hops out to go relieve himself. And immediately, Mary, she hops out of the car too, and she bends down to tie her shoe. Before she could finish tying her shoe, suddenly, something smacked her hard in the back of the head, and it knocked her unconscious. It was Lawrence. He had hid a hammer next to his seat, and when he had gotten out, he did not go relieve himself. Instead, he walked around the vehicle and smashed her in the head. When Mary came to, she realized she was laying down in the back of the van, and as she was looking out the windows, she could see that they were still parked out in the middle of the forest. And then, when she tried to move, she realized her hands, her feet, everything had been tied down to the van. She couldn't move. And so, as she's wondering what's going on, Lawrence comes around. He opens the back doors to this van. He hops inside and he begins assaulting her. Mary has no idea what to do. She's a 15-year-old kid, and this guy is on top of her. He's not stopping. And so she just began quietly begging him to please stop. Set me free. I won't tell anyone. She just kept repeating that over and over and over again. And Lawrence never spoke back. He just continued the assault for hours and hours. Finally, when Lawrence got tired, he got off of Mary, and he climbed out of the back of the truck, and he went around and he climbed into one of the front seats, and he fell asleep. And so Mary probably tried to free herself from her restraints, but there was nothing she could do. The restraints were tied too tightly. And so for hours she must have just laid there wondering what was going to happen to her. And then, at some point in the middle of the night, Lawrence wakes up again. And without saying a word to Mary, he just climbs out of the van and gets into the driver's seat, and then drives the van out of the forest. He drives on the main road for a little while, until he turns down another access road. It takes them away from the main road, so away from any prying eyes, and he comes to a stop somewhere out in this forest. In the middle of this big, Lawrence parks the van. He climbs out and walks around to the back. He opens up the back doors where Mary is laying there, whimpering and crying and begging to be set free. He climbs inside, and her torture continues for hours and hours, until the sun finally came up, at which point Lawrence stopped. He climbed out of the back of the van, and he's standing out there, and he turns around. So he's facing Mary, and he reaches in, and he undoes her restraints. So he frees her. He pulls her out of the van and stands her up on the ground. And so she's crying. She's beaten. She's bloodied. She doesn't know what's going on. and she just gently says to him, "Please set me free." And he says, "Oh, you want to be set free? I'll set you free." And so he walks around this totally destroyed 15-year-old girl, and he reaches into the back of his van where there's this toolbox, and he pulls out a hatchet. And so he walks back, and he's standing in front of Mary, and Mary would have had a fraction of a second to see what was in his hand before. In one fluid motion, he reaches and grabs her left arm with his left hand. He grabs her on the wrist. Then he raises his hatchet up, and he brings it down on her left forearm, severing her arm off right below the elbow. And so Mary falls backwards to the ground, and she looks down at where her left arm just was. She's in shock, and before she can do anything, Lawrence just walks over, and with his left hand again, he reaches over and grabs her right wrist. And now Mary knows what he's about to do. He's still holding this hatchet, and so she's screaming, and she's kicking him as hard as she can to try to get him off of her, but his grip is too strong. And then he begins to chop at her right forearm over and over again. It would take 4 hard blows to finally sever her right arm off of her body. And so Mary falls to the ground in a heap. She's bleeding profusely. She's screaming in agonizing pain. And all Lawrence can focus on is that one of Mary's amputated hands was clutched on to his left arm. When he cut off her left hand, it had gripped onto his arm, and now it was stuck to him. And so, very nonchalantly, he began trying to flick this hand off of his arm. And then finally, when it did come off, he turned and looked at Mary and realized she had gone silent, and she was limp, and she was laying in a huge pool of blood. And so Lawrence put the bloody hatchet back inside of his van. And then he just walked over to Mary and grabbed her and began dragging her. About 100 feet down the road from the van was a culvert. A culvert is a big tunnel that goes underneath roads. It allows water and runoff to pass by the road without damaging it. And so, this particular culvert underneath this access road was built about 30 feet below the surface of the road. And so, if you were standing on the road over the area where this culvert was, if you walked to the edge of the road on either side, there would be a 30-foot drop-off down to the opening of this culvert on either side. And so Lawrence dragged Mary all the way over to this section of the road, over the culvert, and then chucked her lifeless body off the side, smashing it down onto the rocks below. And then Lawrence walked around very carefully, all the way down to her body, and stuffed her inside of the actual culvert. And then, as he was walking away, he said to her, "Now you're free." After Lawrence left, Mary should have been dead. Really, she should have died at several points along this attack. But miraculously, Mary did not die. And in fact, she would later say she vividly remembered the entire attack. She was fully lucid, fully conscious, fully aware for the entire thing, save for the moment when she was knocked unconscious by the hammer. And so she vividly remembered having her arms amputated. And she specifically remembered one particular point in the beginning. Before her left arm, the first arm, had been amputated, he grabbed her left wrist, and she, in turn, instinctively grabbed with her left hand onto his left arm. So she's clutching onto him. And so when he came down and cut her arm off, she began falling backwards. But she remembered thinking to herself, "Why am I falling backwards? I just grabbed onto his arm. I had a firm grip." And then, as she's falling, it's like time is standing still. She literally saw her hand still clutching his arm and saw it had been cut off of her body. And then, when Lawrence cut off her right arm, despite being in agonizing pain, it's like she instinctively understood that she has to pretend to be dead. Otherwise, she will die. And so she went totally limp. Her eyes were half open, and she watched as Lawrence is flicking her left hand, the one that she thought she had gripped onto when she was falling back. She watched as he shook that hand off of his arm, and then she was limp as he grabbed her and dragged her the 100 feet to the culvert. And she was limp and still and didn't make a sound when he threw her 30 feet down onto jagged rocks, and she broke 4 of her ribs. She was in excruciating pain, but her will to survive was telling her, make no sound. Take this punishment, and you will survive. And then, after he left, she remembers thinking, I don't know where he is. He could be waiting up on the road for me. I can't just crawl out and try to save myself because then he might actually finish me off. And so she laid in this culvert, in this horrible position, totally contorted, with her arms gone and broken ribs. And then finally, after a while, she started to feel exceptionally tired. And that was from blood loss. And she said there was a voice in her head telling her, you can't go to sleep. If you go to sleep, you're going to die. And if you die, we can't catch this monster. And he's going to do this to someone else. And so she had this surge of adrenaline where she decided, I'm going to live. I'm going to get out of here. I don't know if he's still up there, but I have to get out and I have to try to save myself. And so, somehow, she got out of the culvert. And then, once she was on the ground, she dug the nubs of her arms into the dirt and attempted to pack the wounds with dirt and mud. And then afterwards, she raised her arms up over her head because she didn't want the blood and muscles to fall out. And so, with her mutilated arms up over her head, she managed to crawl up this embankment, up onto the road. She's got no clothes on. She's covered head to toe in blood. She's in shock, and she starts running down the highway. And a car would actually come by fairly quickly, but they were so startled at what they were seeing, they didn't stop, and they drove on. And so Mary would ultimately run 3 miles on this highway before finally flagging down a passing motorist. It happened to be a young couple, and after they got over the initial shock of what Mary actually looked like, they put her inside of their car, and they sped to the hospital. Mary would stay in the hospital for a month, and during that time she would give police all this information about her attacker, about Lawrence Singleton. And using her very detailed description of him, the police were able to come up with a very good composite sketch. And Lawrence Singleton's neighbor happened to see that sketch, and they turned him in. Lawrence was ultimately sentenced to 14 years in prison for what he did to Mary. It was the maximum sentence that the judge could give. The judge wanted to do more, but legally they couldn't. And so Mary testified at court. And so after it all ended and he was sentenced, Mary was leaving the courthouse. And as she passed by Lawrence, it was the one time she had to be physically close to him. He turned and kind of leaned into her and said, I will finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life. 8 years later, Lawrence was paroled for good behavior. And so, of course, this terrified Mary, who by now had become a wife, and she had 2 sons. And so she's worried that now that this guy is free, he's going to come and finish the job. But Lawrence would not go after Mary. Instead, 10 years after he got out on parole, he would attack another woman, a 31-year-old mother of 3 named Roxanne Hayes, and unfortunately, he would kill her. At Roxanne's murder trial, Mary would actually testify against Lawrence, and her testimony is what they used to secure a death sentence for Lawrence. But before he could be executed, Lawrence died of cancer in jail in 2001. When Mary heard that Lawrence had died, she felt very cheated. However, her sons were very relieved to find out that her attacker had died, and so she took some solace in that. Outrage over Lawrence's early release, considering what he did to Mary, and the fact that that early release led to another person being killed, led to the creation of the Lawrence Singleton Bill, which gives judges the ability to give 25 years to life sentences in cases that, meaning under this bill, Lawrence would never have gotten out of prison after what he did to Mary. A middle-aged man named Frank pulled into a tiny town in Nevada called Kingston. Kingston, which is home to less than 100 people year-round, is so small and desolate and cut off from the rest of the state, and really the rest of the country, that they don't even have It's basically just a collection of a handful of buildings, like a laundromat and a saloon, that are surrounded on one side by this huge mountain range, and on the other, just open desert. At the time, there were really only 2 reasons you would find yourself in Kingston, Nevada. 1, if you lived there or were visiting someone that lived there. Or 2, if you were going to visit the abandoned mines up in the mountain that are right near Kingston. Frank was in Kingston for the latter. For the last 5 years, Frank had been traveling all over Nevada and California, and just the West Coast in general, exploring abandoned mines. And he would film himself while he was in there, and then when he got back to his house, he would upload the footage to his YouTube channel. When he arrived in Kingston, Frank had already uploaded 302 videos to his channel. But despite the very high number of videos on his channel was still very, very small, and it wasn't growing really at all. So for him to be dedicating that much time and energy into making these videos indicated that he wasn't really doing it for YouTube fame. He was doing it because he had a passion for exploring these mines, and he wanted to share it with the few people that subscribed to his channel. And when you look through the first 302 videos on his channel, that passion of his really comes through. He always knows the history of the mine he's about to go into. And when he goes inside, if he finds machinery or pieces of equipment that have been left behind, he immediately knows what they are, and he speaks about them with relative sophistication. He has this lingo that sounds like he understands mines on a really granular level. So when Frank arrived in Kingston in 2013, as far as we know, the only reason he was there was just to do what he always did, which is go explore a couple of cool mines, film it, and then put it on his channel. Except this time, Frank's adventure into these mines right outside of Kingston would be cut short by something he just could not explain. However, he captured it on film, and it's terrifying. The 2 mines that Frank was intending to visit were the Victorine Mine and the Horton Mine. The Horton Mine was constructed first in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and when they built it, they expected it to be a gold mine, but there was no gold inside, so they constructed another mine about 900 feet above where the entrance to the Horton Mine was, they built this other mine, and inside of that mine there was gold. This second mine they built was called the Victorine Mine. When they built the Victorine Mine, they bored this massive hole right outside the entrance to the Victorine Mine that went straight down 900 feet directly into the mountain. And this big hole they drilled went right into the Horton Mine. This was on purpose. They were basically building the equivalent of a laundry chute, except instead of tossing laundry down it, they would toss the ore. They drilled from inside the Victorine Mine. They would drop it down. The chute would fall 900 feet, all the way to the Horton Mine, and that would save them from needing to carry all of this ore all the way down the mountain. Basically, it was a shortcut for the ore. And in the Horton Mine, they built this huge conveyor belt system so that anything that came off of the chute would land at the beginning of this conveyor belt, and it would get brought all the way outside of the mine, where workers could process it and bring it to town. Finally, in 1989, the Victorine Mine ran out of gold, so they permanently shut down that mine, as well as the Horton Mine. These two mines were located about 4 miles to the west of Kingston's town center. And so, when Frank pulled into town, he moved to the western side of town, and then found the access road that would bring him out to these mines. And so he just drove on this road that basically shot straight towards this huge mountain range. And after traveling about 4 miles, he reached this very sharp right turn that basically went straight up a mountain. At this point, there's no more pavement on the road. It's a very narrow trail. It's hard to see. And so Frank would have parked his car, grabbed his camera and his equipment, and begun walking up this mountain. After quite a while, Frank would have passed a couple of run-down old cabins that were kind of overgrown. These cabins were used when these mines were in operation. They helped service the workers while they were out there. But since the mines were abandoned, so too were the cabins. And so when Frank got to these cabins, that would have meant he was very close to the entrance to both of these mines. Frank first went to the Victorine Mine, which would have been very easy to spot, because right outside of its small entrance was this huge piece of what looked like scaffolding. And that was actually the opening to this huge chute that shot down 900 feet to the Horton Mine below. So Frank goes to the Victorine Mine, and he has a look around. But either Frank didn't film his time inside of the Victorine Mine, or he just didn't upload it, because there's no video of him actually going into the Victorine Mine. His camera is turned on this particular day when he's left the Victorine Mine, and he's walked all the way down to the entrance of the Horton Mine. And so we see this video. It opens up with the camera pointing at the entrance to the Horton Mine. And the entrance to the Horton Mine is very bizarre looking. The entrance, which is 20 feet tall, has all these long strips of metal plating that have been kind of anchored up all around the entrance to prevent the entrance from caving in on itself. But despite whatever functional value these copper plates might have had, the aesthetic result is very creepy and makes you not want to go in the entrance. Also, because this mine had been shut down, there's a big gate right in front of this already very foreboding entrance that warns people to not go inside. But Frank seems totally unaffected by this and just strolls right up to the entrance of Horton Mine, and he kind of talks about its history. And then he calmly steps over this warning gate, telling people to stay back, and he begins walking in to this mine. Right away, Frank notices there's quite a bit of water on the ground, and that's cause for concern. Okay, we can go in here and just take a quick look. I don't think I'm going to explore this particular mine. There's a little bit too much water in here, and I know this mine is really old, but I just don't think it's wise to go in here. Try to avoid this if I can. Frank's not concerned that there is water. It's that the water might be stagnant water. In these abandoned mines, there can be poisonous gases that accumulate. And when there is stagnant water, those gases get absorbed into the stagnant water. And so if Frank were to step into one of those puddles of water, he would release those gases from the water, the so-called bad air. And that can actually be deadly. But as Frank is standing there, wondering if he should proceed, he looks down off to the left side, right inside the entranceway, and he notices there's some footprints. So somebody must have come in here recently. And so Frank decides, you know what? I'll go a little bit further in. I'll just be really careful of the water. Frank makes it about 10 feet inside of the entranceway when he lifts his camera up and he looks straight down into the mine. And you get your first look at really what the inside of this mine, and right away you notice there's this yellow, kind of collapsed looking tubing that's hanging down from the ceiling, and that's the old air filtration system. And then when Frank moves maybe another 5 or 10 feet farther into the mine, you see, in addition to this air filtration system, there's also all these metal chains that are just kind of dangling from the ceiling, and they're all over the place. And both the tubing and the chains seem to extend all the way into the tunnel, out of view. Those chains were previously used to hold up the conveyor belt that stretched the entire distance of this mine, which is 600 feet long. They held that conveyor belt up, which carried all of the ore from the chute out of the mine. Even though Frank has seen similar setups in other mines he's been into, he would say on camera that there's just something really off about this mine, that it was really sketching him out, and he wasn't really sure if he should keep going. Yeah, this looks pretty, sketchy. I'll go a few feet further in and check it out, but I think I'm going to pass on this one. He would later reflect on that feeling he had inside of the mine, and he would say, you know, it felt like there was somebody else in that mine watching him. It was just very, very uncomfortable. And so, as Frank is debating whether or not he should continue, just based on this kind of bad vibe he was getting, he looks down and notices there's actually running water. Now, before, at the entrance, it was stagnant. But now, he can see the water inside of this mine. It's not stagnant, it's running. And so, the risk of breathing in any bad air is pretty much gone, meaning this mine is relatively safe. But despite this supposedly positive development for someone who wanted to explore a mine, Frank is still not sure if he should continue. This is one of the creepiest mine tunnels I've ever been in, just because of how dilapidated it is, and all these chains hanging down from the overhead. And there's a shot looking down the tunnel, even further of it. But despite his apprehension, Frank ultimately decides, you know what? He'd come this far, I'll just go a little bit farther. And so Frank makes it to about 100 feet into this mine when he turns around and he films the opening, the entrance to the mine, which is all lit up with sunlight. And he films it kind of to give the audience a sense of just how far he had come into the mine. And so then, after filming the entrance, he turns the camera and he films back down towards the back of the mine, towards the actual end of the mine. Now, at first, you don't see anything unusual. You just see the chains, and it looks kind of like it had for the first couple of minutes of this video. But then Frank pulls his flashlight out, and he shines it down the hall. Looking down the tunnel here, I don't know why that one chain is swinging back there. As we saw, Frank's initial reaction to this swinging chain is speechlessness, and then just sort of this weird statement of fact, like, I don't know how that chain is swinging. And then after staring at this chain and even zooming in on it, trying to kind of figure out what he's looking at, Frank eventually would just turn off his camera, turn around, and leave very quickly. And when he got back to his house, he uploaded this video to his channel with virtually no context. He just said, this is what I saw inside of the Horton mine. And nothing happened. It didn't go viral. It isn't like everybody went crazy when they saw this footage. Instead, I think his audience, they saw this video and didn't really know what to make of it. And then, very quickly, his audience and Frank just kind of forgot about it. And Frank got back into making his kind of traditional videos. Then, about a year later, the YouTube algorithm kind of noticed this Horton mine footage that he had uploaded back in 2013, and it went crazy viral. And immediately, this video was put under the microscope by YouTube personalities, by TV personalities. I mean, everybody was just kind of taken aback by this footage. And what was determined fairly early on was the actual video itself was authentic. Frank really did film a swinging chain in the Horton mine in Nevada. The question became, who swung the chain? There are many people that believe Frank swung the chain, and this is all just one big hoax. And they point to some of his newer videos after this video went viral, where it appears that Frank is kind of actively going out to find paranormal activity versus just going out and exploring mines. And so they point to that and say, look, he's looking for this stuff. This can't be authentic. This video has to be fake. But others say, look, Frank is just a guy who likes going into mines, and he films the inside of these mines. He's been doing it for years and years, and he just happened to be in one when something unexplainable happened, and he happened to catch it on film. And the only reason he began kind of actively looking for paranormal activity after it went viral is because, kind of overnight, his channel exploded. And he suddenly had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of subscribers that all came from that swinging chain video. And they all wanted the same thing, more swinging chain videos, more paranormal content. And so, seeing a great opportunity, Frank went out and began looking for paranormal content. That's why most of his videos after that video, where the swinging chain happened, are kind of geared towards fishing for that kind of stuff. But that first video, that swinging chain video, there wasn't really a good incentive for Frank to fake it at the time he uploaded it. Obviously now you can say, oh well, he staged it because he wanted it to go viral, and he wanted to become famous, and then have this great YouTube career. Look, it's all in front of us. It's so obvious. But how could Frank have possibly predicted that that video would go viral? Going viral is so hard, and it happens so rarely, and it's nearly impossible to predict. And so, how could Frank, who had uploaded hundreds and hundreds of videos before, and none of them had come anywhere near virality. How could he have said, this is going to go viral? It's just such a long shot. It also seems very uncharacteristic for Frank to have been diligently uploading on this YouTube channel, which was basically a passion project for 5 years. He's uploaded 302 videos, and all of them are the same. He's posting the same type of content very consistently for the same small, loyal following. And then, out of left field, he uploads his ghost video with no context. Even if he was trying to go viral with this video, he would have known that the most likely outcome would be that the video did not go viral, and instead his small, loyal following that was used to a particular type of content would see this video and be like, huh? Why did he upload that? Or worse, they would think, is he faking this? Is this a hoax? And if so, that would totally tarnish his reputation, and he'd lose probably some of his precious few subscribers. I mean, it just didn't feel like the juice was worth the squeeze. But regardless, even though lots and lots of people have said, "You're lying, Frank. You're lying, Frank," he said, "I'm not lying. I was in the Horton mine. I filmed what I filmed. It's up to you what you believe."